In this clip, I wanted to show you a traditional yoga posture that's very helpful during the first phase of labor, where we're helping baby drop into the upper portion of the pelvis, so into the inlet. So you can take your block, depending on the mobility of your hips at this stage of the game. You may wish to place the block underneath your tailbone at its highest setting, at its medium setting, or at its lower setting. So that would be all the way to the floor. For myself right now, I think the medium setting is where I'm going to feel most comfortable. So we'll keep that placed there. Our heels are turned in, our toes are turned out. We're going to bring the elbows in along the inside of the knee. And what I'd like you to focus on is drawing the tailbone back behind you. And so there's a sensation of taking the bottom of your pelvis and rocking it back behind you as you tip the front of your pelvis forward. And so we're drawing ourselves into an anterior pelvic tilt. And so as we do this, what we're actually doing is creating length through the pelvic floor, which is very helpful for labor for obvious reasons. This is something I would do on a regular basis during any stage of pregnancy to help prepare and lengthen the pelvic floor. It also can be helpful for the sacrotuberous ligaments to begin releasing as well. I would not do this during the second or third stages of labor, because if we look at how the pelvis functions and how it works with the legs and all of that, if we were to say that my ilium on my right hand side and my ilium on my left hand side are adjoined by the pubic symphysis at the front and the sacrum at the back. So what happens when I laterally rotate my legs is that the head of the femur, so the greater trochanter, is going to press into the acetabulum. And that's a little cup on the inside of my pelvis. It presses on the acetabulum, and it's actually going to push the ilium backward. And it's going to push that ilium toward the sacrum. And so it's actually creating less space in my pelvis, as opposed to when I internally rotate my thigh, I'm going to do the opposite, and I'm going to create space between the sacrum and the ilium. So during the early stages of labor, I want to come into this pose. This is very, very helpful place. We can add the circles that we've been talking about in some of the other videos. But really focusing on that anterior pelvic tilt, drawing the pelvis back and lengthening through the pelvic floor. And this is excellent for helping baby during that first stage of labor to get into the pelvis, so helping them drop down. The other reason that I quite like this posture is that we're getting into the adductors. And this is one of the key muscles that is very helpful for releasing, because this is attached to the pelvis, it pulls on the pelvis. We want this to be open for labor. So I'm going to show you a few other techniques that we can do. You might sit with your partner, having them behind you, and just help them to draw you open. You might even have them draw the legs up and back for you, excuse me. Another way to do this is to come into Baddha Konasana, round angle pose, but I would suggest placing your feet onto a block, bringing them a little bit higher than you normally would into the pose. And be conscious that you're not slouching into the posture and rotating your pelvis to the back. What we want to do is rock and draw the pelvis forward. And we're going to clasp the ankles here using the elbows to draw the legs wide, and we're drawing open and forward. Staying with that easy breath. So let's continue to look at postures that help us to open the pelvis that we can do. We're also wanting to release through the quadriceps, in particular the rectus femoris, which is the muscle that lies along the top. So coming into a standard lunge is going to be very helpful. Of course, when we're pregnant, we will likely want to make a modification so that our arms are along the inside edge of our leg. I might suggest using a bolster or a block or even a chair so that you're not slouching into the posture. Even when people aren't pregnant, something common that I see is a collapsing of the pelvis, where people are actually stretching into their ligaments. And while there are certain ligaments that I do encourage you release for the sake of labor, I don't typically encourage working on them until you're in that third trimester and you've been given the go-ahead by your healthcare practitioner. And I certainly do not recommend stretching the rest of your ligaments. And by that I mean the ligaments that are there to support your sacrum. When these ligaments get overstretched, as often happens when we're in a pose like this and not properly aligned, this is going to accentuate one of the problems that is very typical in pregnancy. And we can start to experience SI pain and even sciatica. So what we want to do is ensure that we're not slouching into the pose. There's a lift through the upper torso. And if we need to, we can use our thigh or a chair or a support, even a wall, so that we're staying aligned. And what's really, one of the other reasons that this is quite important is that if I'm not doing the pose correctly, not only am I stretching those ligaments that are important for my own stability, but I'm not actually accessing the muscle and stretching the muscle that I'm wanting to. So we're going to make sure that hips are straight ahead, toes are curled underneath, and now that back knee is bent, I'm drawing forward. So with my knee on the floor, what I'm starting to get into is that quadriceps muscle group. And as we're stretching during pregnancy, what I always suggest is that feel into where your 100% is and go about 20% less. And this is because typically during the later stages of pregnancy, your body has begun to release relaxin, and this is going to have a loosening effect on just about everything in your body, especially those ligaments. And again, you're putting yourself at risk. So find your 100% and come back about 20% and just hold. We also want to get into the psoas. To get into the psoas, we come into the same posture, but we're going to lift the back knee off the floor. So now we're actually accessing the psoas, getting more into the lower fibers this way. And if we wanted to get into the upper fibers, we would drop that back heel back and lift, taking ourselves into more of a warrior one stance. Focusing more on stability than increasing our flexibility, coming down nice and steady. We also want to get into the quadratus lumborum. This can be a little trickier to do. So what I suggest, especially if you're coming into this posture in later stages of pregnancy, is to sit down onto your side Make sure that your hand is firmly planted on the mat, fingertips pointing away from you. And we're going to straighten that bottom leg and just start to reach toward our toes. And so this is getting into that quadratus lumborum. In your manual, I also show you some supportive techniques that you can utilize with a partner using a massage table to get into this same muscle group. Beautiful. Depending on where your body's feeling these days, you can get a little bit more sensation by bringing that arm forward and coming in. But I don't recommend that if that feels unstable or like something's being pulled in an unpleasant way. Let's come from here. So we've talked about releasing the inner thigh. We've talked about releasing the front of the thighs. And we've even talked about releasing the QL region, so that into that lower back. The last thing that I want to talk about is getting not into, you hear a lot of people talking about releasing the iliotibial band. We don't want to do that. We actually want to keep this nice and stable. This is going to be providing us with stability during pregnancy and beyond. But what I would like to see is two things. We want to release the piriformis. So we want to support releasing through the external hip rotators, really highlighting the piriformis. And we also want to ensure that the tensor fascia lata, which is more to the anterior part of the hip, is firing and that we're using that to our benefit. And this is because when we use tensor fascia lata, there's two very specific things that are happening. First off, tensor fascia lata facilitates abduction, so that's when we take the leg away. And it also helps us with medial thigh rotation. Medial thigh rotation and the ability to medially rotate your thighs is key for having a positive birth outcome in normal healthy labor by opening the pelvis. And we will talk about that more in a further video. So again, we're going to talk about some techniques for releasing the external hip rotators and the piriformis, and we're going to talk about working with the tensor fascia lata to help it properly engage so that we can abduct and medially rotate the thigh. Okay, so let's do that. So first off, to get into piriformis, what I would suggest doing is using a prop. So you might use a couch, you might use your coffee table, whatever's really accessible to you. It could be a bar stool. And you might do this from a standing position. I'm doing this for the purposes of the video more from a kneeling position. You might also wish to be near a wall for stability purposes. And we want to bring our leg up. And so we have a nice firm flexion through our foot. We're in dorsiflexion. We're bending through that knee, a nice right angle. And you might not even need to lean forward to start feeling some sensation. We want to ensure that with our base leg, especially if we're standing, that we're activating a pelvic loop, that we're lifting up along the front of the hip and drawing down along the back of the hip, keeping nice and stable. So not collapsing or allowing dysfunction through that glute med. So if you do need more sensation, then of course drawing a little bit further forward. Beautiful. You might also choose to do this just safely on the floor. And you can do that by coming into what we call a Z pose. Sometimes this is called the deer pose. And so we bring the foot in front of us, flexing through the leg, and gently draw forward. Of course, we would do this on both sides. But why don't we start talking about getting that tensor fascia lata to fire properly? You can do this from a seated or standing position. And I would suggest using a yoga block between your knees and maybe even tying a strap or a scarf around your thighs. I'm just going to use my hands in this video. And what I want to do is press out into my hands and then push into the block. As I push into the block, I want to focus on that medial rotation, so the sensation of tacking my thighs back. You might wish to do this, since we are working with pregnancy, we might wish to do this on the floor or seated in a chair as well. But our main intention is to focus on that medial thigh rotation and then pushing out through the legs, so practicing abduction. And this helps that tensor fascia lata to fire, which, as I said earlier, is going to help us in later pregnancy and especially in that final phase of labor.